Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start our evolution PowerPoint on mammals. The PowerPoint's going to be really quick, not many slides. Most of the class is going to be based on a movie or a documentary on mammal evolution. It really shows you a lot better than what I ever could in a PowerPoint. So I'm going to go quickly through it. I will create a worksheet for this, but it's not something that has to be submitted. I'm really going to be focusing on you watching the documentary and answering questions on that. However, I would recommend doing the worksheet because that will be questions that are going to be on the exam. So even if you want to go ahead and print it out and then write the answers down, that way when you're taking the exam, you have access to all of your information, all your notes and whatnot. So mammal evolution, again, is better represented in the documentary, but I'm going to go ahead and start showing you some piece of information and try to prove to you that mammals came from reptiles. That's the whole point behind it, this particular PowerPoint. But again, the video is much more convincing than me. So the mammals that we're familiar with that we see today, often we're thought of as being a relatively new species, and that probably is the case because the diversification really happened during the Cenozoic, which is about between 70 and 50 million years ago. But we see that when we look at fossil record that there were approximately about small mammals that are about 260 million years ago. So what do those mammals look like? If you had to say, according to this picture, some sort of rodent would probably be a good representative. They weren't actually in the Rodentia family, but in the Insectivora family. So tree shrew or Scandentia would be a better example of an ancient mammal. So here, what we did is we found a fossil in China, approximately, it was 260 million years old. So really from the fossil, we're able to determine from the bone structure approximately what it would look like. So maybe even almost looks like an opossum, really. So mammal evolution was, when we look at mammals, we see in the fossil record that they're extremely small. And that makes sense because they were trying to avoid larger predators in the reptile family, in the dinosaur family, and they were most likely nocturnal. We can see that by the structure of their eyes and their brain. Their eyes are quite large and wide for trying to receive a lot more light during the nighttime. So if you could just imagine like an owl, yeah, those large eyes. So some primates you may even see with like the large eyes. That again is to get more light in during nocturnal time. So this is probably to avoid predators, but again, that's just our hypothesis. So here you can see the Hadrocodium fossil that was in 2002, and even more recently, they're still finding that's like a hotspot in that particular part of China to find these particular fossils of this really, really small mammal, which again was called the Hadrocodium. And here you can see a picture of the skull. This is actually the real skull. And again, this is just a picture, or rendering of what it would look like based on the skull and the fossil, bones. And then you can see a paper clip as a reference. So they're quite small. So mammals' inner ear bones probably evolved from modified ancestral reptile jaws. Again, that's for better hearing. So you might have remembered this from the last slide. What we see is that the reptilian jaw has many different components in it. Here we see that the mammal jaw only has one. So what we see a lot of times in evolution is not removal completely of bones, but modification of bones. So these bones have been modified to represent, in this case, 3 ear bones. Here's a little bit better of a picture. Okay, so here you see the reptilian ear bones. So really what they're doing is they're representing, in this picture, how they hear, which is almost like a drum. So they hear vibrations very well. And that served their purposes quite fine. For mammals, if they were living in a dark environment, nocturnal environment, hearing was essential. So vibration would be fine, but where the vibration is coming from is a lot better way to represent or to locate a predator. So it's pretty much the same thing with the sound, but what it does is it has these bones in order to send information to the brain to actually locate where that sound is coming from. So the best way to explain it is if you could just imagine if you're in a movie theater, or even if at home, if you have, different speakers all around you in your room, you can hear the different sounds where it's coming from. So that's what our ears are able to do. You can hear, if someone's talking to you, are they in front of you? Are they, screaming your name behind you? You can hear where that sound is coming from in location based on those 3 ear bones, where reptiles won't hear where it's they'll hear it, but they won't hear where it's coming from. So a lot of times you'll see reptiles and even birds kind of move their head in order to get that signal a little bit better to actually now locate. We don't have to turn our head. We can hear where it's coming from. So that's really, really important, especially if you're trying to avoid a predator. You know where it's coming. If it's coming behind you, if it's coming in front of you, if you can't see because it's nighttime. So this video is just a quick. Here we go. Is it working? Yeah. Okay. So you might be familiar with this with earth science if you took it. So Pangea. So you see the separation of the continents, and also you can see that the land is becoming drier over time. So when we see environment changes, we see animals change. They have to adapt to a new environment, right? Just like us, we had to change. We see the corona coming at us, and we had to change our behavior. So animals have to do the same thing. Plants have to do the same thing. They have to change their environment. Change their environment. Sorry, when their environment changes, they have to change with it. It's not that they have a choice, but certain adaptations that they have might be favored in a different environment. So with a cooler, drier environment, what we see is modification in body structure and also in size. We also see the reduction in size as the Earth becomes cooler. Early on in mammal evolution, when it is warmer, you actually do see larger mammals, like mammoths and things like that, quite large. But in this case, as time progressed, it definitely became cooler, drier, and mammals became smaller in size. So here you can see in millions of years, believe it or not, if you go all the way down here, you see, okay, that looks like a mammal. I get it. It looks like a little possum, right? Eutherians are actually marsupials. But either way, as you're going up here, you see a reptile. So you're like, wait a second, that's our ancestor. And the reality is that it is our ancestor, is a reptile. And again, the documentary will kind of, hopefully prove that to you with data and facts. Okay, so, and those data and facts are based all on fossil and anatomy. So that's where they're really going to point out. So where they originate from. So these are the kind of questions that you'd see on the exam. And I'll go over them with you. So if you want to write them down, you have, the information for the exam. So based on the fossil record from the picture on the last slide, where did the ancestral mammal originate from? So if we go back, right, we can see that the mammal, right, an ancestral mammal, right, would be a reptile. And if you wanted to label it as Dimetrodon, you can. On your exam, I think it does say reptile. How did the Earth change over time? Well, we did say as the Earth changed, right, through continental drift, the tectonic plates, as they're moving, right, you can physically see, right, the planet is changing not only in the continents, but it's becoming drier and cooler. So we see a different type of environment, and therefore we see a different type of animals evolving over that change in environment. All right, so how could this have changed the environment? So how the Earth changed over time, right? We see Pangea, right? The continents are drifting. And how could this have changed the environment? It made it drier and cooler based on the shifting, right? The continents are going away from the equatorial area, so it became drier and cooler. Could this environment change cause a change in the type of species found? Definitely, right? How so? As we always see in evolution, as the environments change, animals and plants have to change. So a good point behind that is if you look at a shark, they live in the ocean, and a lot of their environments pretty much relatively been the same. And they've also remained relatively the same for the past hundreds of millions of years. So we see that, and even like horseshoe crabs, right? If we see animals that look ancient to us, they really are ancient, in that they haven't really changed very much in evolutionary time, an evolutionary time span, because their environment hasn't changed. Okay, so what is a synapsid? It's kind of a mouthful to say. Synapsid is your ancestor. It was the Dimetrodon that you saw in the earlier picture. Here you see a picture of it. Again, this is all based on fossil record, these drawings. And they have a weird characteristic, these reptiles, of really not just a reptile, but also some mammals. So they're kind of like a hybrid in between. So synapsids are the original ancestor of mammals, and synapsids look very reptile-like. So how could they be our ancestor? Well, if we look at their fossil structure or their skeletal structure, we look at their bones. Here it's a little hard to see, but here if you look at a synapsid skull, you could see a red and a blue opening. That's the nasal cavity. We're not going to really focus on that. But what happens is a synapsid, right? These two openings are quite distinct. And then as time progressed through evolution, we actually see, as time progresses, we could see a modification where it becomes one, which is a mammal. So what does that look like? Here's synapsid. You have two temporal openings very close to each other. And then in this human one, I don't know if I can move myself. Yeah, I can. Cool. And if you see over here, you also have, I'm sorry, right over here, you see that temporal opening. Okay, so the temporal opening is right behind the base of your eye, right? And unfortunately, in a human, it's a little bit harder to see. You actually have your muscles right behind that, your masseter muscles right behind that temporal opening. So there's one temporal opening right over here. Okay. And then if you look at diapsids, which are relatives of or ancient ancestors of turtles, birds, lizards, and even dinosaurs, they wound up having two temporal openings right over here. Okay. So synapsid have one temporal opening, right over here. Here's our eye socket, right? Here's a temporal opening. Here's our eye socket. Here's our temporal opening. Sorry, that I've been a little bit confusing on that one, right? And what you see is that they match, right? And here's a nose. So nose, eye, temporal opening. Nose, eye, temporal opening. So they match. So that's our ancestor. That's just one piece. Still, like I said, a documentary will show you many more. But if we look at a reptile skull, right? Or if you look at a diapsid skull, which is the ancestor of dinosaurs, you actually wind up having two temporal openings. So we see that if we had to pick the best match for our ancestor, it definitely would be synapsid, right? The other thing is they also had different types of teeth, which could modify their chewing behavior. So again, they also had that, piece that shows that they're related to us, our ancestor. So we're not going to watch a video because the documentary really discusses much better. Here's a couple other questions. But again, these will be focused on the documentary, so we don't need to answer these by watching this video. But I'll still go over what you're going to see in the video. So what defines a mammal? Really, it's lactogenic. It gives milk, but it's those three ear bones that really, really 100% defines that it's a mammal. Very unique. So a species is not simply a collection of living things, and systematics is a tool set that uses cladistics for common ancestry and a collection of organisms. So let's look at that on the next slide for that. This would be a little bit easier to. So we want to know, so the whole point behind this, and I did last year, did this with lecture, but and this quick video, but the documentary will show, but here you can, it's just such a hard reach to say that this Dimetrodon became us, right? How is that even possible, and you could see why people say, evolutionary design doesn't make sense, there's got to be another mechanism, but if you look at the steps, it does. Okay, so we're going to look at the cladogram. This is also going to be on your exam, so you definitely want to be comfortable reading a cladogram. So let's go over these 5 questions. Okay, so the first question we're going to focus on is what organisms are most closely related to placental mammals? Okay, so let's look at that. So if we look at placental mammals, we see it all the way here. Now, when you look at a cladogram, you can see that it looks like a family tree, and that's pretty much what it is, but over a longer period of time. So hundreds of millions of years, right? And if we look at the branching, you see these little dots. These dots are called nodes or branches where there's a common ancestor. Okay, so sometimes they're labeled, sometimes they're not. Sometimes we know, sometimes based on fossil record, and sometimes it's a hypothesis. So some of the major ones are already labeled for us. So we could see which ones are most closely related placentals. Well, if we read our family tree, right, we find placentals here, right, and the most closely related would be the marsupials. Okay, and again, they're all mammals. They're in that mammal group, right, but they're more of an ancient mammal than placental mammals. Okay. So what organisms are most closely related to placental mammals? Those would be marsupials, would be the answer for that. What are the three types of mammals? Well, let's go back. And again, you're going to have the cladogram right on your exam. So it's really just how to read this, right? Not memorization piece at all. And scientists would do the same thing. They don't memorize the cladogram. I mean, unless they do and they use it all the time. But for the most part, they're using it as a reference sheet. So what are the three mammals? Okay, well, look at here. Here's our node right here. That's our mammalia, right? That's Latin for mammals. And you could see the three. You have to read to the right here. Okay, so here you have monotremes, marsupials, and placentals. Why is it not to the left? Because so the ancestor actually of mammals is right here. It itself is not a mammal. All right, but from that particular node, we find that mammals start to, evolve. Okay, so that might be a little bit confusing, right? This one's not a mammal, only to the right. Okay, so next question that would be on your test. What organism is least related to mammals? Okay, so on this, and again, remember everything's going to be multiple choice. The least related, right, would be so these are our mammals. Okay. I didn't mean to don't do that. All right. These three are our mammals. Okay. And then the least related, you have to go to the left, right? So this would be the most closely related mammals, then secondly, thirdly, and so on. So the least related would be the furthest away to our left. So the least would be our lungfish. Okay. Not too bad. And what is the ancestor of all mammals? Okay, so let's go and look at that. What is the ancestor of all mammals? So you could say this one, but it's not really labeled. You could say the ancestor of all mammals was this, or this, or this. Okay. Now there could be more names here. We just don't have it in this particular cladogram. So what's the ancestor? Right, would be the cynodontia, pterapsids, or synapsids, right? So the most closely related to ancestor mammals would be the first, this would be the second, hard to do, and then this would be the third. Okay, so as you're going away from the left, you're further related to that particular organism that you're interested in discussing. In this case, it's the mammals, okay? And what do you think the ancestral animal look like? Hint, go back and look at your notes. So what do these things look like? Even though on the cladogram it's just the names, most likely these are, and here we mentioned here, so go back and look at your notes at what a synapsid looks like. These are going to be, and we can go ahead and just do that real quick. Okay, so here we have, this is actually pterapsid right here. I don't have it labeled, and this is synapsid. So really, what do they look like? Reptiles, right? All right, so reptiles is what they look like. Great. So what you're going to be doing is you're going to be watching the Interfish documentary, and there'll be a worksheet that goes with it. That's what's going to count for this week's assignment. But again, I did write down those questions so that you can go ahead, write the answers based on this video, and you can go ahead and have that for when you're doing your exam. So, but that's not required for you to enter into Schoology. Only this worksheet for Interfish will be required. Okay? Have a great week. Talk to you soon.